I've really enjoyed working in the government. I had the wonderful opportunity to work for three federal agencies. I started at NSA doing access control solutions, spent a year at the Federal Reserve Board, doing audit and security assessments on the banks. And then I also spent 10 and a half years at the Central Intelligence Agency. And so it was a fantastic place to go and learn skills that were extremely helpful.
Today we are talking about AI, we are talking about machine learning as well. What technologies excite you particularly, when you see the future or the vision for the next 5 to 6 years?
Yeah, so I think AI is taking off like we haven't seen before. It's at such a huge, unprecedented rate. And when I think about that, I don't like to be vague. I like to be very, very specific. And so we say, well, if AI is taking off, what are we really focused on? What are the key threats? Is it we're worried about employees going to ChatGPT, uploading documents from the company and saying, please rewrite it so that it sounds more professional, and we're losing intellectual property. We're seeing technologies, and we have a portfolio company called Lumia that's really focused on securing these types of problem sets. So I'm seeing a lot of these threat-driven approaches for technology. There's a threat we have to identify first. Then we have to say, well, how urgent is this threat to solve? And then what we do is we talk to hundreds of CISOs and say, is this interesting to you? And they say yes. And if it's a big trend, then we start to build out companies.
Hi, you're watching The Mainstream. I'm Simran Shiwalkar, your host for today, and we are back with a new episode of Voice of CISO, one of our exclusive series. Today, I'm particularly thrilled because we are joined by a cybersecurity leader who has seen cybersecurity from vantage points very few can claim. Well, we have Mr. Ross Young today. Firstly, Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, he needs no introduction. I will still take this opportunity to share a few things about Mr. Young, right from covert intelligence missions as a CIA officer to steering security strategies at Fortune 1000 companies. Ross's journey reflects a rare blend of national security expertise along with leadership. Now, as a CISO in residence at Team8, he helps build the next generation of cybersecurity solutions, advising startups and global organizations alike. In today's conversation, we'll take a deep dive into his journey. We'll also decode lessons from intelligence, resilience in crisis, and what it takes to lead security in an increasingly volatile digital world. Without any further ado, let's begin. Ross, let's lead with your journey. Like I said, your journey has been different, right? From operations at the CIA to leading cybersecurity at Fortune 1000 companies. Can you tell us what has been the biggest mind shift that you've seen and how has it been so far?
I've really enjoyed working in the government. I had the wonderful opportunity to work for three federal agencies. I started at NSA doing access control solutions, spent a year at the Federal Reserve Board, doing audit and security assessments on the banks. And then I also spent 10 and a half years at the Central Intelligence Agency. And so it was a fantastic place to go and learn skills that were extremely helpful for my career. And I think that ability of going to places where you have to always be learning, where you're always thinking about how do I help the organization achieve its goals and mission has really translated for me on the commercial sector, because we have different goals, primarily to make profit or generate revenue for our shareholders. But it's about accomplishing that same mission and what moves the needle a little bit.
Wonderful. Again, Ross, coming back to your experience and expertise in today's enterprise environment, from your point of view, where do you see the biggest blind spots that CIOs, or cybersecurity leaders are kind of still missing or, underestimating?
In cybersecurity, there's always two things that are competing for resources. You have all of the governance, risk, and compliance activities that say this regulation forces me to do something. And it doesn't matter if that regulation was written 10 years ago and cyber attacks look nothing like that anymore. And so we spend time and resources and efforts and all these things focused on those things that just don't really matter anymore. And you can just think of examples of, hey, it used to be really bad where you would go to public networks and your Wi-Fi may be sniffed. But now with modern encryption and modern VPNs and modern TLS everywhere, that's not really a thing. So when the auditors say, hey, let's go focus on these things, it's not really relevant. Instead, what is it we should be focused on today? Look at non-human identity attacks. Right now, you have secrets, you have API keys, and all these things being stolen. And it's one of the most popular ways to break into companies today. But you don't actually see that in any of the standards because it's a new attack that's really less than a couple years old, and it's just increasing like crazy. And so what happens is, as much as I want to put all of my budget into top edge focused attacks like that, if I still have auditors and regulators looking at things from 10-year-old standards, they're going to steal my resources away from where I want to point the organization. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we struggle with today is, can I really focus the things that cause the highest risk, or am I focused on doing what I have to comply with?
Absolutely. Again, along these lines, for someone who has worked for both government as well as private sectors, how do you think leadership kind of, have that kind of high stakes security, or how does it differ when we talk about private sectors and government sectors today? What is the approach?
So I think we both have different advantages and disadvantages. Most people don't think about this, but in the government, you're actually quite limited on your budget, right? So the government doesn't buy the most expensive tools because they don't have the budget to. I mean, just think of your local school education system. They just are very, very limited, which is why everybody's on Chromebooks and other things that are typically considered lower cost. Now, sometimes they're actually a lot more secure. I would actually argue that Chromebooks are superior to Mac and superior to Windows in security any day of the week. But when you think of, hey, we're limited on budget, it actually forces us to do different things. That's why in the defense sector and in the intelligence sector, you actually have a standalone classified network where it doesn't touch the internet, right? So those types of things provide other layers of security. Now, on the commercial side, we typically see sectors that have very, very good spending. A good example would be the financial services. They can buy the best technologies. They are the ones really influencing the state of the art, both from the regulation perspective and the technology innovation that they're spending money on. So in that regard, sometimes they're a little less safe because they don't truly have this, we don't touch the internet service. It's actually quite different. You expect customers to come to your banking websites and perform, financial activities like, doing checks and paying their credit card bills. And so in some ways it's drastically different, but you can buy technologies. I think the biggest difference that I would also say is in the government, especially in the military, you're fighting or you're training. So you tend to be training quite a bit. We don't see as much of that on the commercial side. So how do we invest more in our people? How do we train them up and make sure they're full performance as quick as possible and build those training programs? I think that's an opportunity we can learn a little bit more from the government.
Absolutely. So, do you think private sectors kind of have an edge over, when we talk about building cybersecurity strategies? Would it be safe to assume so?
I think they don't. And it's because they're not taught in the same attack methodologies, right? So take an example. If I work at CIA and NSA, I'm going to think of insider threats to get into places. I'm going to build some really, really cool technologies like what you may have seen leaked in WikiLeaks over years prior, right? And all these are different ways to break into a company. Now, go to the average bank or healthcare organization, right? What's their core focus? Well, if I'm a bank, it's providing financial services to my customers. If I'm a healthcare, it's providing, health solutions to the patients that come in. They're not absolutely thinking about, well, what happens if someone comes in and does this thumb drive attack or someone starts tampering with these things? It's just not their core mission. But when you go to the intelligence sector, understanding that everyone can be recruited as a human asset and turned to a spy, that is a core belief because you've just had so many case studies where people have betrayed their country. And so I don't think they have that same level of what I would call cyber vigilance, even though they may have the technologies. And the other thing is, are they actually incentivized by the top leadership to do what's right from a cyber perspective, right? If the core business is making money, that sometimes comes as a trade-off. Well, how much should we spend on cybersecurity? 5%? 20%? Well, that costs revenue for the company if we have to pay that to the cyber program. So there's always these balances. And what I would say is historically, the appetite typically isn't there, except for certain sectors like the financial sector, it's really there. Also, as we start to think about the government power, water, electricity, those areas where they just know they are such a target for enemy state attacks to come after them, there's a little bit more of that paranoia and how do we secure these things, but it's also balanced by budgets as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for throwing light on that critical aspect, Ross. And again, I understand that as a CISO in residence at Team 8, I'm aware you work closely with early stage cyber startups. Today we are talking about AI, we are talking about machine learning as well. What technologies excite you particularly, when you see the future or the vision for the next 5 to 6 years?
Yeah, so I think AI is taking off like we haven't seen before. It's at such a huge, unprecedented rate. And when I think about that, I don't like to be vague. I like to be very, very specific. And so we say, well, if AI is taking off, what are we really focused on? What are the key threats? Is it we're worried about employees going to ChatGPT, uploading documents from the company and saying, please rewrite it so that it sounds more professional, and we're losing intellectual property. We're seeing technologies, and we have a portfolio company called Lumia that's really focused on securing these types of problem sets. We're also seeing other problem sets that are evolving, like hallucinations. And this is interesting because with new technologies come new types of attacks. We didn't have hallucinations when we purposely coded every response from a chatbot. But now when the chatbot can kind of think and respond natively, it can make stuff up. And so we have to think about, well, how are we going to secure these things? And, maybe we have to fuzz it with 500 inputs to figure out what comes out correct and what comes out incorrect. And so I'm seeing a lot of these threat-driven approaches for technology. There's a threat we have to identify first. Then we have to say, well, how urgent is this threat to solve? And then what we do is we talk to hundreds of CISOs and say, is this interesting to you? And they say yes. And if it's a big trend, then we start to build out companies. And the areas right now I see really evolving are what I would call SOC of the future. If you think about the attackers are automating their attacks, well, how do we automate defenses even faster than what we had traditionally with SOAR? I think that's a huge area for improvement. The second thing is, I think there are classic problems we've always sucked at and struggled with. And I'll just give you an example. Patch management. Everybody knows software patches are tricky, and it's something we've struggled at for 20 years. But if we don't get patching better, then from there, we're only going to have more issues. So how do we transform patch management to be something like, hey, AI just wrote all the code for you and fixed your vulns? And then how do we automate the testing and deploy that faster? So I think those are sample areas where we're going to see a significant amount of innovation on that patch management piece, on this SOC of the future, and really on what do AI security solutions look like to help our industry.
So, do you think AI could essentially be used, or do you see this as an opportunity rather than a threat when we talk about building cybersecurity strategies today?
I absolutely think it's a great opportunity. Take any job in the world. There are mundane tasks in that job. And what we need to think about is how do we build a process to automate that? So take, for example, here's an architect. And every time an organization wants to do a new application, someone has to build a Visio diagram. And then after they build that Visio diagram, a bunch of smart people have to review it, make sure there's nothing wrong in that architecture. And like, oh, it's not behind a web application firewall, or, oh, you didn't tie into our access control system, or, oh, you're not sending logs to the SIM. That type of activity is very expensive. Someone's actually got to manually create that diagram. Someone actually has to manually review those things. And we tend to be looking for the same evidence over and over and over. So there's no reason why we can't say, instead of building this manually in Visio, how about we use an AWS service to build this diagram for us? And then at the same thing, instead of a human interviewing this diagram and inspecting it, well, why don't we just say, look at this diagram, look at these firewall rules, kind of use an infrastructure as code way to analyze this based off their Terraform files. And now what happens is my folks who are my architects, instead of having to manually review, they end up being someone to kind of write what are the policy as code. And that allows them to scale to thousands of developers when before they only have time for, dozens of developers. So I think we're going to see this where we have to document our processes, we have to digitize our processes, we have to streamline everything, and then we can start to automate this. And this is where agentic AI security is really taking off. And we think we're going to see a lot of improvements in speed and automation based on these types of opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think previously it was Gen AI, and now we have agents or agentic AI that is kind of, making buzz. Thank you so much for being comprehensive, Ross. Lastly, before we conclude, I also would like to understand from you any key recommendations or best practices from your point of view for the next gen of CISOs or cybersecurity leaders, who are kind of looking or stepping into an increasingly complex threat landscape when we talk about innovations like AI taking over the decade now.
Yeah, so I've written about this quite a bit. I would highly recommend anybody Google search the OWASP UASP TASM, TASM, or Threat and Safeguard Matrix. In there, what you'll see is I wrote about 7 different AI attacks that I think are high likelihood to play out. And then what I do is I build this defense in depth framework where you say, okay, if someone is going to create a website and that website is vulnerable to hallucinations, how would we identify everywhere in an organization where those applications could be built? And then after we figure out what applications are in scope in our organization, how would we stop that attack? And if we couldn't stop it, how would we detect that attack had occurred and then respond and recover? And I think we have to take that focus of a threat lens of here's something we're worried about and go through that NIST cybersecurity framework of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover to help really think about how we're going to build these safeguards to help secure the organization. And if you take that, you're going to go and see just how different they are. The way you secure hallucination attacks is so very different than the way you secure against data loss prevention type of things you have to deal with. And so highly recommend taking a look at that OWASP threat and safeguard matrix work that I put out there, because I think it really helps a lot of practitioners and cybersecurity leaders in this field.
Ross, thank you once again for sharing your insights with us today. I think with technologies like AI, there is going to be a tectonic shift when we talk about the risk landscape today. And certainly, like you said, when we talk about government and private sectors, both, there is a differentiation. But once again, thank you so much for sharing your journey as well with us. And while we wrap up, I also look forward to connect with you again.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to come on the show. If anybody's interested in following up, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just reply to any of my posts. I'm happy to connect.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think our viewers and audience have a lot to take away from the sessions, and most certainly we look forward to connect with you again. Thank you once again.
No problem. Have a great day.
You as well. Bye bye.